And thank you for the invitation here to all the organizers. I'm really honored to be here at the ASPENBRAINLAB, and I welcome the opportunity to share with you what I've learned about the importance of sleep for brain health and the impact, the influence of the brain on aging. So what I'd like to do is to begin by just pointing out how sleep deprived we are as a society. Only 1 out of 3 Americans report that they regularly get a sufficient amount of sleep. 50 million Americans a month struggle to stay awake while they're on the nation's highways, resulting in more than 1 million crashes every year, 50,000 debilitating injuries, and nearly 7,000 deaths every year. It's one out of 5 car crashes and serious car crash injuries. So it's an amazing problem. I think of that as a barometer of how sleep deprived we are as a society. And it doesn't just impact safety in that way, but it also impacts our brain's emotional health. You know, when we're sleep deprived, we get burned out, we are more likely to suffer from depression, increased risk of suicide, anxiety disorders, and just a emotional lability that happens when we have not gotten enough sleep. The amygdala, which is the area of the brain that was just talked about with respect to the previous presentation, is the emotional center of the brain. And when we haven't gotten enough sleep, the same stimulus, the same disturbing images or whatever is done, even under in a brain scanning, the amygdala has 10 times the response when we haven't gotten enough sleep. And that's why we become more emotionally volatile. So why does the brain need sleep anyway? Sleep, when I was starting, was thought to be of the brain, for the brain, and by the brain. We now know that it also is important for the body. But one of the things that sleep does for the brain is that it restores the energy stores that we have in the brain. The brain uses more energy by weight than any other part of the body. It's only 2 to 3% of the weight of the body, and yet the brain uses 20 to 30% of all the oxygen that we consume and all of the glucose energy that we consume. So it's a tremendously high energy burning organ. And when we have depleted the energy, which is in the form of adenosine triphosphate, when we burn off those high energy phosphate bonds, we're left with adenosine. And as adenosine levels rise in the brain, that signals us that we need to get to sleep. We feel sleepy. So I see many people here have an adenosine antagonist that they may be using to help them, which is one of the most commonly used drugs in the world, and of course it is caffeine. And that masks that signal so that we don't realize that we need the sleep. And so when we don't restore that energy, we feel fatigued, sluggish. That's what results in the burnout that I was talking about before. The other important function of sleep is memory consolidation. So during the beginning of sleep, during deep, slow-wave sleep at the beginning of the night, that's when we consolidate the memories for what we learned during the daytime. And that happens in the beginning of the night. We store away those memories. And that happens, by the way, and we rehearse what we've done during the daytime. And those rehearsals in the storage of those memories happen at 15, 20, 25 times real time. So if you've learned a new piece on the piano with your right hand, the area that controls the movement of that hand will have much deeper slow-wave sleep in the beginning of the night, and we'll be rehearsing that over and over again. So you'll be able to do it much more quickly with fewer errors the next day. And if we don't do that high intensity rehearsal, then we don't gain, we don't consolidate those memories after sleep, and we become more forgetful. And that can masquerade as cognitive impairment, particularly as we get older. And so we may think that we're sort of losing it because we can't remember things, but that may be because our sleep is in some way disturbed. Then, in the latter half of the night, if your alarm doesn't go off a couple of hours before you should be waking up, how many people here spontaneously awaken in the morning without an alarm clock? That is fantastic. And I applaud you for being able to do that. So many people are enslaved to the alarm clock, waking them up in the morning. And when that happens, you lose the last couple of hours of sleep, which are deeply enriched in rapid eye movement sleep. That's the sleep stage associated with vivid dreaming. In that sleep stage, we integrate the information that we learned and we stored in the beginning of sleep with everything that we already knew before that. And that's when we begin to solve problems. And the session on sleep could also be in the creative brain, because if we don't get that rapid eye movement sleep, and by the way, that happens in real time. So if you're watching a ping pong game, your eyes are going back and forth at the rate that it takes the ping pong to go back and forth across the table. But if we don't do that integration and have these bizarre dreams, then that impairs our creativity and problem solving. And finally, and this is one of the most recently understood phenomenon in the last 5 years or so, and that is that during sleep, critical brain maintenance activities happen. And we clear waste that is built up during the day. So any high energy utilization system, if you're burning a lot of energy, just like your furnace, it needs to be cleared out because gunk and soot and everything accumulates. Well, in the brain, we accumulate molecules like amyloid beta, which are products of energy consumption. And if the amyloid beta accumulates and is not cleared out, then that's what causes neurodegeneration and conditions like cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease. And that is at much greater risk in individuals who have disturbed sleep or for whatever reason are not getting enough sleep. And I'll show you some pictures. So these are newly discovered lymphatic channels in the brain that are sleeves that are where these molecules, this debris is removed. And here's a cartoon showing how that happens. These sleeves are around the arteries and the veins, and the arterioles and the venules. And there is convective flow. And none of this was realized 6 years ago. And if you see here, let's see, can I make a, I don't know if there's a pointer, but anyway, you can see those in this cartoon, you see the black globs. That's the metabolic debris that's accumulating during wakefulness, during high brain activity associated with wakefulness. Well, that is being cleared by this convective flow of this newly discovered lymphatic system. And the amazing thing is that the support cells of the brain actually shrink during sleep, allowing these channels to become larger, and the convective flow is 2 to 3 times greater during sleep, and that's when you remove this gunk that has accumulated during wakefulness. But if you don't get the sleep that you need, then you're going to be at increased risk for cognitive impairment associated with the accumulation of these metabolic debris. Now, it's not just the brain that needs sleep, but also the body that needs sleep. And so the cardiovascular system needs sleep, and if we don't get the sleep that we need, then we are at increased risk for hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and stroke. Sleep is also critically important in the regulation of appetite. Someplace during evolution, sleep and appetite got linked. And maybe it's because no other animals stay awake all night unless they're starving. So the brain goes into starvation mode when we are not sleeping. And what does that mean? That means we squirrel away all the calories that we eat into fat when we're not sleeping, when we're not sleeping, and we become ravenously hungry, so we overeat. Any of you who have stayed up all night flying to, overseas, whatever, you become much more hungry, and you're not hungry for like salads. You want junk food, you want high carbohydrate foods, you want sugary snacks, and so on, because that's what the brain is craving. We release more of the hormone ghrelin that makes us hungry, and less of the hormone leptin that makes us satisfied with what we eat. And it is thought that the sleep deficiency that has been accumulating in the United States over the past 50 to 70 years. We've been getting less and less and less sleep. Has associated with overeating and weight gain and may be a contributing factor to the obesity epidemic that we have in the United States, where, not in Colorado, but in most of the United States, 2 out of 3 Americans are either overweight or obese. And interestingly, when you look at the obesity maps, they're parallel with the maps of where people are getting an insufficient amount of sleep by state. Now, not only is it related to appetite, but sleep deficiency is also related to our ability to maintain control of our glucose levels. So we normally fast during the night. At least during evolution, we would have done that. And so we release a hormone, melatonin, that both helps us to sleep at night, but it also impairs the activity of insulin so that we become insulin resistant. And it helps the brain maintain glucose levels throughout the night. Great. But this system evolved at a time when we didn't have access to food at night. So now we open the refrigerator and we eat when that hormone is being released. Or we take melatonin because we think, oh, this is going to help us sleep. And then just before going to bed, we have a snack or we eat during the night. Now our glucose levels are going to go much higher and can put us in a pre-diabetic state or increase the risk of frank diabetes. So eating at night is a problem. And if you restrict your eating to 12 hours a day, and most Americans eat every moment that they're awake, but if you restrict your eating to 12 hours a day, you can actually eat the same amount and you will lose weight. It's remarkable. In fact, if you do 2 things, if you restrict your eating to 12 hours a day and you get a sufficient amount of sleep, you will actually lose fat when you go on a diet. If you're getting an insufficient amount of sleep when you go on a diet, 75% of the weight that you lose will be in lean body mass, your muscles, and not fat, because your brain is in starvation mode, so you'll be squirreling away everything you eat into fat, even though you're restricting the amount of food that you're eating. So maintenance of insulin glucose regulation, if you're getting an insufficient amount of sleep, it increases the risk of metabolic syndrome and diabetes. And finally, the immune system is affected by sleep deficiency. So, I always wonder why the government doesn't say when it's time for the flu season for everybody to make sure they get a sufficient amount of sleep before they get the flu shot, because you only have half the antibody response if you're sleep deprived when you get the flu shot, in the week before you get the flu shot, as compared to if you're getting a sufficient amount of sleep. And similarly, if during the winter you're exposed to the rhinovirus, if you're not getting enough sleep, you have a 200 to 300% increased risk of actually catching a cold. And most people know this. I mean, they say, I'm run down, I got a cold. Well, it's not that they suddenly, when they weren't run down, they were still being exposed to the rhinovirus, but they don't succumb to the infection. Okay, so in order to thrive, one of the simplest things that we can do is to make sure that we get enough sleep. And for the average adult, that means 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night. Children need more sleep. High school kids need 8 to 10 hours of sleep. Toddlers in their first year of life need at least 12 hours of sleep. In fact, if children get less than 12 hours of sleep in their first year of life, they have a 300% increased risk of being overweight when they start preschool. I mean, it's at every age. 12-year-old girls and boys, if they're not getting enough sleep at that age, when they're 30, they have a much greater risk of being overweight. So these are, during development is the most critical time, and that's why it's so unfortunate the high schools are starting school at 7 in the morning. It was known a century ago. Here in the United States, it was demonstrated that if you start before 9 o'clock in the morning, the schools, that the children will get, if you start at 7, they'll get 2 hours less sleep. And Professor Terman at Stanford in 1911 said we must never go to the European system of starting at 7 o'clock in the morning because our kids will miss the sleep that they critically need. And now we're starting at 7, and in Europe they're starting at 9. So duration is critically important. The second key aspect is timing, which is just as important, a consistent bedtime and a consistent wake time. And that's why I always say, you know, on your iPhones, there's an opportunity, or smartphones, there's an opportunity to actually set an alarm for bedtime. You know, we set an alarm for wake time. We should be setting it for bedtime to remind us to make sure that we get the sleep that we need. And the final aspect is sleep quality. And what do I mean by sleep quality? Well, I'll show you in a minute, but sleep disorders are one of the biggest things that degrade the quality of sleep. So summarizing, the number of hours awake contribute to our fatigue during the daytime. If we're getting an insufficient amount of sleep every night, that'll build up a sleep debt, which will degrade our ability to function. If we're trying to stay awake at 3 o'clock in the morning and our brain is geared to being asleep at that time, like we travel across time zones, that's going to cause fatigue. If we have just awoken, I mean, most couples realize, you know, in the first few minutes after awakening, this is not the time to have an intense discussion. You know, better to have a shower, that's good for the relationship. Because people don't even, you know, they're so degraded during those first few minutes of awakening that they may say something inappropriate. But let's talk about sleep disorders. So sleep disorders, the big four are insomnia, sleep apnea, shift work disorder, and restless leg syndrome. I'm going to really talk mostly about insomnia and sleep apnea. Let's start with sleep apnea. So sleep apnea is a condition where you can't breathe and sleep at the same time, and that's a problem. So everybody thinks it's associated with snoring, and snoring is one of the symptoms of sleep apnea. But the real problem is when you stop snoring, okay, and have witnessed apneas. So if you have a bed partner and the bed partner is driving you up the wall because of the snoring and so on, and then you think, oh, they've stopped snoring, thank God, make sure they're breathing. So I'm going to show you a video, and I'm going to ask you, you know, Glenda said, you know, we can't have too many videos. Well, this is a video where we're actually watching someone snoring during sleep. And I want you to stop breathing when he stops breathing. Can you turn up the volume so we can hear the snoring, please? Nice, good snore. Another good snore. Great, everything's going well. Everything's fine. Get ready to stop breathing. Oh, stop breathing. Hold your breath now. I want everybody to hold your breath. See if you can hold your breath as long as he can, even though we haven't done cold therapy. I know that. He's still not breathing. Still not breathing. All right, you can breathe. Don't get too relaxed, though. He's going to stop breathing again. Now, when he stops breathing, okay, stop breathing, everybody. When he stops breathing, you can recognize how your heart is beginning to race, how your blood pressure is rising. So during sleep, the cardiovascular system is supposed to be getting the rest that it needs. With sleep apnea, these recurrent, and this happens 200 to 300 times per night. All right, you can breathe again. 200 to 300 times per night. So you can understand why it increases the risk of cardiovascular death by 420%. So let's look at some historical data of individuals. They were 48 when they started the study. At the time, it was thought if you didn't complain of daytime sleepiness, you shouldn't be treated. So the epidemiologists just followed them and said, what happens? Okay, so 100% of them are alive at the beginning. Now, there's a little fall off at the beginning, but they're still doing okay. But look at that. After 10 to 15 years, the survival among those with sleep apnea is 58% as compared to 94% of the people who would have been who were 66 at the time that this happened. So 18 years later. And those who, of the 58% who are still alive, they had cognitive impairment 10 years earlier, and Alzheimer's disease 5 years earlier. So we're talking about a very serious, everybody laughs when somebody snores. It's not a joke. It's a very serious health condition that directly affects the brain. And so, and it happens most commonly in people who are overweight and people who are snorers. Children who snore, even once an hour, grade school children, they need to have their tonsils out usually because it can really impair their ability to learn in school and give them a lifelong problem. So, and the good news is that sleep apnea is treatable, either with the CPAP machine, oral appliances like like a retainer that you put in when you, dental retainer that moves forward your lower jaw by about 2 to 3 millimeters, and even certain types of surgeries. Chronic insomnia, also not as dramatically, but increases the risk of premature death. Instead of increasing it by 6 times like sleep apnea does, it doubles the risk of death. And again, the great news is that cognitive behavioral therapy is a terrific treatment for insomnia. It's available online through programs like Sleepio and Shut-Eye, and therapists are able to administer it. Relaxation techniques like meditation, yoga, deep breathing, proper sleep hygiene, a consistent bedtime, wake time, and medications can be used on a short-term basis. The wonderful news is that even individuals in incredibly sleep-challenged environments, like firefighters, we can increase dramatically their sleep duration, sleep quality, and improve their daytime alertness. We can reduce their risk of injury by 25% and cut in half their disability day usage with this kind of a program. In fact, we just won the National Safety Council Green Cross for Safety Innovation Award this year through this program. So what can you do? For the astronauts, we just relamped the International Space Station to provide tunable lighting where we can expose them to shorter wavelength light in the morning and longer wavelength light in the evening. You can keep a consistent sleep schedule, allow enough time in bed to sleep a sufficient amount each night, maintain a cool, dark, quiet environment for sleep, establish a relaxing nightly routine, exercise regularly during the daytime. It takes 2 hours to metabolize each shot or glass of wine. So I'm not suggesting that everyone become a day drinker, but you should account for that because alcohol interferes with sleep. Keep electronics, as Glenda said, out of the bedroom, and limit your exposure to blue-enriched light in the evening. I would avoid off-label use of medications like Benadryl and Tylenol PM. Melatonin can be helpful, but you need to get pharmaceutical-grade melatonin. Pure Encapsulations and REM Fresh are 2 brands that are pharmaceutical-grade, and you ideally want to take sub-milligram doses. Keep the sleep stealers out of your environment, like the iPhone, the cigarettes. Caffeine has a 6 to 9 hour half-life. Dogs, I love dogs. We have 2 dogs. They don't belong in the bedroom. And with that, I will end. It can really transform your life. You will have more energy during the daytime. Your memory will be better. You will be, you'll even look better. There's a study showing that people who have lost a night of sleep and taken portrait images, all shaved, cleaned up, and versus people who have slept the night before, people can recognize when they're shown these images within 4 seconds, and they want to spend time. These are the same people. They want to spend time with the ones who've slept. They don't want to get near the ones who are sleep deprived. So it does affect how you look as well. So thank you very much.